from the World Bank. You have the word, Kopp.
Thank you very much. Before I start, for the World Bank, the topic of this session is the driving forces of mobility. And for us, it is an important topic to see that mobility drives development and that mobility changes the spatial character of countries and that this brings about very important productivity effects that leads to higher incomes. Higher incomes, in turn, lead to higher demand for mobility. So mobility creates development, and development demands mobility. And this is why for us, traditionally, goods transport was much more important than what is talked about here. But now urban transport has become a very hot topic, and all the nice recipes we have already heard about lead for the World Bank to the question, so you want us to have mass transit systems and you have individual car use-based systems? Isn't it that mass transit has less than 2% of passenger kilometers in the United States of America? And we have to have very good arguments to say there is something in there for you to have a different type of mobility than what the industrial countries have gone through historically. This is a bit of the background to what I will present here. So what drives mobility? It is, first of all, the affordability of transport services, and that is that people have the income to afford more mobility, to have their own car, and to consume more transport kilometers. In freight transport, it's the opportunities of trade, and easing the movement of goods instead of passengers, what we have talked about, means that it accelerates urbanization. So it creates kind of the problems we focus on most of the time in this session, in that lowered freight transport costs reduce the competitiveness of smaller cities and lead to the drive of larger cities and megacities in particular. And passenger transport in the urban centers is very much driven by land market dynamics. It is much less a matter of decisionistic decisions of urban planners, but how the land market works in city centers. And how mobility evolves in urban centers is very much determined by early developments of infrastructure. And this is why we want to convince developing country mayors that having a balanced modal structure or having more mass transit implies that they will have lower transport costs in the long run, given the technology trends, the increases in the prices of fossil fuels, and maybe the global policy trends, if we think of carbon pricing. And finally, what drives the demand for the special type of mobility that FISITA is maybe most interested in is, of course, the convenience and of cars, and the fact that once you have one, the cost is largely sunk and you will be driving it. This is how passenger demand increases with income, and we see that there is a strong increase if we look at countries with different per capita incomes for an increase in mobility when countries become richer. But at the same time, there are important differences, and we can see this in a pattern in the following slides too. There is North America, Canada would also rank here, then there is Europe as a subcloud, and then there are Asian countries. Hong Kong, Singapore, and Korea is this group, and this is a pattern that repeats itself in many ways if we look at data. In freight transport, we see that we have a very similar trend, and that this depends on trade integration, not only on on income, but also on trade integration and the geography of countries. If you have a small country, this is smaller, but even here we see that the intensity of road goods transport is low in Asian countries and is high in the US, but it is a more dispersed European group here. This is how the demand for vehicles changes with income, and this is a much more dramatic pattern. We see that when countries getting to a per capita income of $8,000 to $10,000 per year, that there is kind of an explosion of, in the demand for vehicles. And this is where we have our difficulties in discussing with decision makers in developing countries. They want to know why they should take the burden to counter this strong demand for motorization. It is a political cost to them, and we have to give them arguments to implement strategies that differ from the accommodation of the demand for individual cars. And mobility ensures that there are these gains from trade, and this is why traditionally road construction with aiming at easing goods movement was the emphasis of the World Bank. And the lowering of transport costs means for trade what the reduction of tariffs means for international trade. It reduces the trade costs, it leads to more specialization, it leads to the gains of agglomeration economies in the cities, and this drives the demand for mobility. And lower trade costs, therefore, increase growth. And we have many examples that easing goods transport leads to substantial productivity increases. There is a detailed documentation for the creation of the highway system in the US that all the communities along the highways had a relative increase of their incomes of 7 to 10% compared to other communities. And for the international economy, there are even examples of higher increases to the productivity of the countries that have greater access to international markets. City growth is driven by agglomeration economies. Cities' productivity depends on the wish of producers to locate there, and producers want to locate in a particular city because they want to be near each other. There is something of a benefit of nearness. And this wish of producers to be together and have workers that are close to their production sites means that you have an increasing demand for land in urban areas. And this increasing demand for land drives up the land rents. And traditional locations and traditional quarters with relatively poor populations are often driven out. I have the pleasure to be in a program that is run by IFMO on the mobility cultures of megacities, but there is a consistent pattern that the developing megacities have this feature, that poorer quarters are run over by the demand for land, and once they are driven out to outskirts of the cities, there is a stronger separation from jobs and residential locations, and this creates an enormous demand for transportation. The further this increases the size of the city, the area size of the city, the more difficult it becomes to serve this mobility demand without the car and do this with public transport. That people demand mobility has a lot to do with the fact that they want to avoid the high rents of inner cities, rather have higher transport costs, but move out from the inner cities to enjoy lower land rents. The city growth transport link, this mechanism of how people reduce their overall housing and transport costs by relocating within a city area is driven by the infrastructure that is created in early stages. And alternatives to individual car use, mass transit systems, they have a strong influence of how the form of a city develops. And the other, for us, the more important component that shapes, or equally important component that shapes the urban form is how expensive is individual car use. All the cities that have a high share of mass transit have relatively high prices for individual car use. We have seen that there is this strong demand for motorization, and this is only contained if we have incentives on the demand side that signal opportunities by using mass transit. For us, we have the problem, the bank is very much inclined to think in supply side terms. Let's have mass transit systems, let's create the infrastructure, and demand will follow. We see that oftentimes this creates excess capacity if the incentives on the demand side are missing. I mean, the starkest story in this sense is the United States of America, where additional mass transit capacity is created without inducing a demand change, and the load factors in mass transit systems are reduced to an extent that the emissions per passenger kilometer in the US are now higher than in individual car use. And what we propose as a new strategic access point to this discussion is that there should be a pricing of the external costs of all transport, and that these will be relatively high for individual car use in terms of congestion charges, in terms of charges for local air pollution, and organizing road safety, that safety risks are properly priced, and to price greenhouse gas emissions. The promise this holds for developing cities, rapidly developing cities, is that they might have lower transport costs in the future when the price for fossil fuel increases or when carbon prices will be implemented, and they avoid very high health costs. On local air pollution, I have, for example, advised the city of Riyadh, which is a car city in the classification of JEF, and after decades of accommodating the rampant growth for individual mobility, they noticed that 40% of all kids below the age of 14 have asthma, and it's identified to come from pollution from the individual mobility. This shows that there is a choice. This graph shows energy consumption in road transport, and it is increasing with per capita incomes, and here we have even a far greater diversity in the per capita consumption. Here we have the US, Arab countries. Here is again the European group, and the lower bound of the cloud is always the Asian countries. But how this was brought about in Asian countries had often to do with making individual car use expensive. And the most drastic example is the example of Hong Kong. The car registrations in Hong Kong increased in the 70s by more than 100%, and Hong Kong had a severe congestion problem, stalling the development of the city, and the city government trebled license fee for cars to 90% of their import value. And this has led in 7 years to a halving of car ownership in Hong Kong. At 2 years after introducing the license fee, there was a plan to introduce a congestion charge, which was dropped because there was not enough congestion. and much of the remaining individual cars were taxis. And what is the difficulty of containing individual car use or reacting to the demand for individual car use and making people feel the external costs that are caused by individual car use are the attributes that individual car use brings. The diagrams we have seen in the climate change discussions of the marginal costs of using low fossil fuel cars are misleading to the extent that people associate other things with the consumption of car services. It is not about having minimal energy intake, but by having all kinds of other amenities provided with the car that are difficult to provide in mass transit systems. And this has to do with status, with beauty, with individualism, and also with the ability to have entertainment that is your personal one. And there is a big difference in how this is seen in developed countries and developing countries. Whether you want to renounce to the attributes has a lot to do of what you already have. There is an asymmetry in going forward to having nicer cars, or if you are forced to go down from having already very nicely equipped luxury cars. So this is what it is. My time is up. The demand for mobility is driven by income, but mobility increases income at the same time. There is a circle. Economic development is driven by and requires higher levels of mobility. And this includes not only passenger transport, but goods transport too. There is a high willingness to accept high fixed costs. The people who reach a household income of $10,000, they want to incur high fixed costs to have a car, even if this is a high share in their household incomes. Vehicle choice is not about getting from A to B only. It is about buying attributes, consumption attributes that go beyond the pure mobility function. And the weighting of this attribute changes with time, and this determines the difficulties and the cost to change mobility politically. Thank you.